This week on Dialogue, the politics of protest. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Joining us this week, John Nichols is the nation's Washington correspondent and the associate editor of the Capital Times in Madison, Wisconsin. He's also author or co-author of 8 books, including his newest, Uprising, How Wisconsin Renewed the Politics of Protest from Madison to Wall Street. Kent Hughes is an economist and author. He's also director of 2 Wilson Center programs, the Program on America and the Global Economy and Wilson Center on the Hill. Gentlemen, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
John, I'm going to ask you to set the scene for us of what started with Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin that led to this movement, led to this book, led to today's discussion.
Well, I'm a native Wisconsinite. My family goes back in Wisconsin to 1823.
Thank you for not wearing the cheese head today.
It clashes a little bit with the suit. Not much, but my people go back to 1823, 1824. They came as lead miners, and so my roots are in this place. And though I cover national politics, I've always obviously maintained a kind of a deep connection to where I come from. And Wisconsin became sort of the center of national attention for several weeks back in the start of 2011. The best place to begin is actually with the election of 2010 and say that you had a Republican wave. Republicans won all over the country, much more so in the states than at the national level. And in Wisconsin, Republicans took full control. Governorship, both houses of the state legislature. Governor Scott Walker, a guy I've known for decades, conservative guy, but he still surprised everyone when he proposed structural changes, fundamental structural changes that essentially undermined the collective bargaining rights of public sector unions, shifted the civil service so that many civil service positions became political appointees, and really kind of altered how the state did business. Now, the way that we talk about politics these days, the assumption is you get elected, you start to make those changes, you can do it. But the people of Wisconsin had another idea. They didn't like such fundamental changes. There was a feeling that Walker was going much further than what he had been elected to do. And so folks started protesting. It was students first, because students are the least cynical. I mean, they've just learned about the Constitution. They've learned that they have a right to assemble and petition for the redress of grievances. And they came out and did it. First big protest, about 1,000 students. Next day, a lot of public employees joining. You got up to about 10,000. By the end of the week, 50,000 people on that Friday night were in front of the Capitol. The next day, someplace in the range of 80 to 100,000 were out. And on and off over the period of the next 3 weeks, inside the Capitol and out, sometimes inside the Capitol as many as 2,000 or 3,000 people sleeping through the night, each night on the floor of the Capitol, outside protesting. And their message was actually a very focused message. It was about labor rights. It was about political rights. But it was also about something more. It was sort of the first pushback against this austerity agenda. And that goes all the way up to the federal level, changing Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, down to the state level, less money for public education, less money for services, more privatization.
And really around the globe.
Absolutely. And the best way to understand Wisconsin is to understand that while it's a different place and the issues are unique, that the arc of protests that we've seen around the world, from Tunisia to Egypt, did surface in Wisconsin, had a very inspirational character to it, especially for people on the left. And you saw it spread to Ohio, where you had similar struggle. And finally, I think there was some influence on Occupy Wall Street. So it's a pretty epic little tale.
And as we discuss things, we'll connect those dots. But Kent, I want to begin with and let me beat you to it. You're an economist. On the other hand, okay, I've said it for you. But
only Harry Truman were here.
but one thing, we've had these discussions on and off the air as we've looked at this fiscal crisis, for lack of a better term, both in the United States and around the globe. And Governor Walker said, essentially the deficit made me do it. That this was a necessary response to a budget problem in the state of Wisconsin, which certainly reflects arguments we've heard from Greece to Capitol Hill. Is this, on a microcosm level, illustrative of what's happening everywhere as far as this debate between austerity, cut, versus stimulus spend?
Well, there has been a wave of thinking in Europe, even more than here, that austerity is going to promote growth. And in a sense, we're having a real-time experiment with it in Europe, and so far, it's not working well. That the predictions about austerity from a more traditional, maybe a more Keynesian point of view, appear to be correct. That's not the way to restore long-term growth.
So why does it persist in the face of the evidence you just referenced?
Well, I think that in part in Europe and also here, people do identify a very serious long-term problem. That at some point you can't continue to run large deficits. We tend to ignore the other big deficit, which is the current account. We're basically using an international credit card to help keep our consumption up and so forth. We can't continue to do that. So it's a real problem. The question is, how do you go about attacking it? Going back to the specific example of Wisconsin, and I'm a country boy from Oregon, so I learned a lot about Wisconsin reading the book.
Well, and Wisconsin and Oregon were two of the great progressive states of a century ago.
Yeah, and I would say Oregon still is very early.
I was born
with,
in the Bronx. I can't claim your country
You'll
roots.
always be catching up with us.
Initiative and referendum and those
exactly.
those kind of changes in popular democracy. But it seemed to me that the point that Governor Walker was making was he had a deficit he had to deal with. And unlike the federal government, except for Vermont, every state has a balanced budget amendment. They have to balance the books. But it appeared that his structural changes were not so obviously linked to balancing this year's or next year's budget. And as I remember, and you correct me because you are the Wisconsinite here, but that the civil servants and the public servant unions were both saying, well, we're perfect. We understand that we're going to have to make some sacrifices here. We can delay, we can cut wages, whatever. But that next step,
Giving up collective bargaining
actually
rights.
making that kind of structural change was what they didn't want, and apparently a lot of other Wisconsinites felt strongly about it. But also it wasn't clear that you could really link that to the budgetary problems that Wisconsin was having this year. And I think that's probably what helped get some resistance to Governor Walker.
Is this a classic case of overreach where Governor Walker misread his mandate?
No, I don't think so. I think it was a classic case of overreach to the extent that the governor, like governors in other states, and while I focus on Wisconsin in the title, the book is really about exactly what you're talking about, sort of these broad questions. I think that it turned out to be overreach because people responded, and no politician wants to get 150,000 people in the street protesting him. You don't seek that at the beginning of a struggle. But I think this was about an assumption that has been so powerful in our society for the last, really the better part of 30 years, that the governor can almost be excused for, presuming that he could do this. And that is that unions had pretty much exhausted their usefulness, that their day had passed, and that people didn't particularly care for unions. And they particularly, the theory that they didn't care for public sector unions. Teachers, snowplow drivers, all these forces. It's been talked down for so long. So much of our media, portraying this as an inefficiency or as some kind of a barrier even. Public sector unions, teacher unions, a barrier to reform, stuff like that. So I think the governor, who's a conservative, just assumed he could do it. What was amazing about Wisconsin, and what was amazing about some of these other states where you've seen these sorts of uprisings, is that deep within the body politic, someplace in the spirit, is a sense that, working people ought to have some way in which to organize themselves and push back. Because if they don't, they're going to have very, very little voice in an era of Citizens United and corporate money in politics and sort of this overwhelming power at the top. And so I think that was a huge part of what happened in Wisconsin, that an awful lot of people said, I may not even love unions, but I really think we need them.
The whole, when the imbalance began between management power and labor power, people point to Ronald Reagan's firing of the air traffic controllers. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on when this begins to erode, when we reach a state where the equilibrium is off. But, you see attacks in the political discourse on education, on teacher unions. it's become quite popular
Oh, yeah.
to be disrespectful to unions or dismissive of unions, yet public opinion polling tells a different story. It shows a lot of support for labor.
I think you can look at several developments that led us in this direction, but you have to go back quite a number of years. I think, for instance, the theories of Milton Friedman, brilliant, insightful, path-breaking work on what exacerbated the Great Depression in terms of monetary policy, but also an emphasis that you just want to be out for yourself. That's the way to really, going back to Adam Smith, the way you really serve the public interest. Then you had a period after World War II where there was such a confidence in government. The government had seemed to have fought the Great Depression, won World War II, beat Nazism, militarism in Japan, and there was almost 3 decades of really extraordinary growth, which was widely spread. Then, starting with the credibility gap in Vietnam, Watergate, which was a shock to the country, and then by the end of the 1970s, you had this era of stagflation, that somehow the government couldn't do it anymore. And then we think of Ronald Reagan's very successful campaign, and part of his emphasis was the government is the problem, not the solution. And we really have had 3 decades in which that thinking has really become ever more entrenched. So, for instance, if you do a public opinion survey of young people today, they actually say they think they're more likely to encounter an alien from another planet than they are to get a Social Security check. Now, this isn't what the numbers say, but there is this, so up until I would say the financial crisis, where we're now rethinking the balance between the right kind of regulation and the markets, and are often quite critical of the regulators themselves, who seem to accept the idea that the markets are pretty much going to take care of themselves.
Another confusing part of this story, John, is shifting from the economics of it to the press coverage of the protests.
Yeah.
The Tea Party received what appeared to be a disproportionate amount of coverage based on the size of the crowds. And crowd estimates have become a political hot potato.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah.
But you know, there were times where the visuals didn't lie as far as the amount of people at various Tea Party rallies, and yet often Fox News, where you could write it off to some partisan preference. But it wasn't just Fox that was covering the Tea Party movement. Why wasn't there as intense coverage of the protests in Wisconsin as there have been for the Tea Party?
Well, I think that's a terrific question. I think it relates to all the stuff we're talking about here. For one thing, I'm always very cautious. I've written a lot of books about media. Very cautious about criticizing Fox. And I'll tell you why. It's so easy, right? You can say, well, Fox did this, Fox did that. And it's true. In Wisconsin, bizarrely enough, some of Fox's coverage of what was going on in Wisconsin on the Bill O'Reilly show featured a discussion about union violence. Well, the Wisconsin protests were incredibly peaceful. The police all said this was amazing. You could have this many people together and no arrests, no trouble. And yet, Fox was talking about union violence. It was only when you pulled back from the video that you saw there were palm trees in the shot. You know, they'd taken stock footage. And but
maybe union violence, but not in
not
Wisconsin.
there, yeah. And so it was. So you can always criticize there, but I think it goes to something deeper, and it's what you were just talking about. It is this attitude, this thinking that government really is a problem, that people don't like it, and I think that has permeated media to a large extent. And so initially, I don't think most media could imagine that you could have mass protests, the kinds of numbers comparable to Tunisia or Egypt, in the middle of America, up in a northern city, snowy, cold. And so it took a lot of media a little bit of time to catch up with it. And one of the things that I found amazing, 2 things. One, we've had a real downsizing of media in America. We don't pay as much for it. Most of our media outlets tend to go for the easy, quick hit. They like to run the video but not actually send the reporter out to do it. And so the amazing thing was much of the coverage of Wisconsin was some video footage and then people sitting in a studio in Washington talking about it, who hadn't been there, who hadn't seen it. And I think that was very tragic, because what happened in Wisconsin was not merely political and economic, it was also emotional. When you were there amongst these huge crowds of people, many of them very, very young, folks who had never been involved before, you saw the power of a peaceful mass of people. And those of us who've covered wars in the Middle East and things in Africa, and I've been very lucky to go around the world and see it, there are transformative moments in your life when you can be among a lot of people. Wisconsin was one of those. Whether you were in approval of it or disapprove, it was amazing. And any media that covered it from afar missed the heart of the story.
Well, you know, this is also, we'll move from emotional to psychological, so I'll go way beyond my competence.
Let's go.
You know, you mentioned the Arab Spring and protests around the world. We really get excited as Americans to cover those and to cheer those on. Yet we react very differently to protests in our own country. What's that all about?
Well, let me just grab one piece, and I want to hear these other wise thoughts on it. But man, that is so true. And Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, introduced his set of changes, radical changes in labor law and things like that, the day after Hosni Mubarak stepped down. And the joke in Wisconsin, maybe not fair to my old friend Scott, is that Walker looked around the world, saw the world was one dictator short, and decided to fill the void. But the jokes are always rooted in connections people make. On the first days of the protests, I went out, I was covering them, and I ran into a guy who had a sign in Arabic, right? And of course, everybody before these protests spent the last month watching Egypt. And I said to this guy, good, solid Wisconsinite, I've covered a lot of wars in the Middle East. He walked up and I said, Assalamu alaikum. And he said, I don't speak Arabic. And I said, you can understand my confusion, the sign. And he said, oh, that. I went online, I did one of those translation things. It says, if Egypt could get rid of Mubarak, we can get rid of Scott Walker. So people made these connections, but our media just had a terrible time imagining that there could be some sort of comparison, some sort of connection, even though a good economist will tell you that these austerity fights were an underpinning of what you saw in Tunisia and in Egypt.
I wanted to jump in on the austerity and look at it in terms of a lot of the private sector workers and the austerity that they're going through.
Yes.
The anxiety about losing their job. Wages, we know, have actually been stagnant at best. Partly that's the consistent rising of healthcare costs, but it's also global competition, domestic competition. So you have the need to balance that budget. And I'm worried about losing my job. I haven't gotten an increase in pay for 10 years. And now you're going to raise my taxes to take care of a civil servant who has tenure and has no risk of losing their job. So there may be another element of that perspective. That is, it's not so much just resentment, it's just not fair. I mean,
well, that's not class warfare, but it's the politics of resentment. You're trying to play.
Well, also, it's the politics of you could, from their point of view, say a different kind of fairness. I'm taking a sacrifice. Everybody has to.
It's human need. It's like you support your kids, you pay for your house. You look at how do I balance this budget at home, and that was something Governor Walker in Wisconsin really counted on. He counted on a divide between public sector and private sector workers, and that at the end of the day, the private sector workers wouldn't come out and on the side. But it didn't work. It was very interesting, and because there's another dynamic here, and that is that an awful lot of private sector workers have been hit hard by policy, trade policy that they don't like. They think it closes factories and ships jobs overseas. Also, tax policies that seem to encourage companies to relocate outside the U.S. All these things that we hear talked about, that's a long period of time where there's a lot of private sector workers who have been conscious that they've been undermined. And one of the things that happened in Wisconsin was that I think there was a lot of very smart communication early on that if you take down public sector workers, if you take away their pay, their pensions, and remember, as has been pointed out, they were willing to accept cuts. But if you really destroy public sector unions, there's not going to be much base with which to push back for private sector either. And so at these mass demonstrations, amidst you'd see the signs for AFSCME and the teachers' unions, public sector unions, but you'd also see the UAW and the steelworkers right with them. And I do think that is a function of these austerity moments, not just in the U.S., but internationally, where everybody starts to sort of get that when this cutting begins, it's probably not just going to stop with your neighbor. It's probably going to be you too.
Well, this raises another question, this notion of competition for resources. That is are we missing the forest from the trees? In other words, are we really broke, or do we have a big distribution problem?
Well, I think we're, even on average, even with frozen wages, if you look around the world, we're an extraordinarily rich country. And longer term, we will have to decide what balance we want to have between a social safety net and other kinds of spending, between investing in the future and other kinds of spending.
Kent, have you looked at it I'm sorry to interrupt you, but have you looked at it as a per capita number? In other words, what I'm trying to get a grip on is how wealthy we are as a group. I know that a lot of individuals aren't, but as a group, how wealthy we are now compared to other periods in U.S. history.
Well, if you're looking just at an average, we've continued to grow up, and this is now pre-Lehman, pre the financial crisis. We'd continued to grow. We'd had on and off productivity growth, but the distribution of those gains has really been skewed to the top 20% of the income distribution.
So why isn't that the focus? I mean, look, you come at this as a nonpartisan, just looking at facts and figures. It seems like a math problem.
It's a moral problem.
A moral? I think
it's a moral problem.
You could even say it's an investment problem. That there's many ways
that we're investing in the wrong
quote
things?
unquote redistribute. I think that there are still areas in the country where the level of K through 12 education is outrageous. Half the children drop out of school, half of them are not prepared. Those that do graduate, half are not prepared for the 21st century. So you could have, in a sense, a redistribution or an increase in broad-based opportunity by shifting some of our spending in that direction.
And I think this is what I mean, but I think we're actually saying the same thing, although
my economist
friend uses investment. I use moral, but we're talking about the same thing. Because, of course, how we choose to spend our money is a choice. It is a choice. Decisions are made, and there is a moral element to it. And budgets are statements of our values and our priorities.
Priorities, absolutely.
And where we choose to invest, also who we choose to ask to pay for it. These are fundamental choices. And what we've seen over the last year is an opening up of the dialogue. We haven't gotten any place. We're just beginning to talk in broader terms and maybe deeper terms. For a period after President Obama came into office, there was really a pushback saying, look, government's spending an awfully lot of money and we're not seeing a lot of improvement. And so maybe government, as Ronald Reagan says, really is the problem. And then, you saw this great reaction in 2010. Now you're seeing sort of a pushback saying, maybe the problem isn't just where government invests. Maybe it's the extent to which how we tax, who we tax, what we make our priorities in our society, where we put our money, as has just been suggested, education, services versus enriching a handful of folks. When we get into those kinds of dialogues, they can be very intense, they can be passionate, they can be scary, and that's good for us because that's when we're talking about what matters. And that's why I use the word moral, because that word scares people.
Well, it's also, if you look at reasons people vote, they vote based on morality and ethics and character. This is why they make their choices.
And elections should matter. They shouldn't just be a theater that we watch from the sidelines as spectators. They should be about something.
Speaking of something, you say this is a movement. You think this is a game changer or a tipping point.
Potentially, yeah.
Potentially. Well, that's what I want to ask you about. What's your best evidence that this really is something different and not episodic?
Doing a book tour.
Okay, that's it for this week. That's a perfect answer. We should end there.
No, do you want to know that the book tour? I got to tell you, it's painful and scary. Knock on wood, because it's an honesty test, right? You think, well, I wrote a book. I think people are going to care about this, right. And you go out to places around the country, and if they come out in big numbers, if there's packed rooms and people really want to talk about it, they don't care about me. They care about, what's this issue? What are we talking about here? Then you know that there's something out there that people want to tap into. When I go on talk radio, and I'll do conservative, liberal shows. I'm very much on the left. That's obvious, I think. But the callers, the phones light up. People want to talk about it. And that's what tells me anecdotally, and there's polling evidence to suggest there's a lot of energy here as well, but anecdotally, people are ready, I think, for much deeper dialogue about economics and about policies that relates to economics. And they are also, I believe, ready to play out their politics not just on Election Day, but to go out and do something I don't think many of us thought they were going to do, which is come out in big numbers and protest.
Well, Election Day, you brought that up. The Tea Party, which is a different kind of movement on a number of levels,
some ways, yeah.
But it has a lot of similarities. They've had electoral success. The Tea Party has had impact on Election Day. Can this movement, and what do you call it beyond Wisconsin? Is it the Occupy movement?
I think Occupy has become a default word for it. But I will say that it has already had profound electoral impact, because Barack Obama started 2011 sounding like Paul Ryan's little brother. He was talking about, cuts and austerity, and, we're going to have to accept that. Remember, he accepted maintaining the Reagan or the Bush tax cuts.
Right.
And he ended the year talking about taxing the rich and about potential for new stimulus, and not apologizing for, but defending the auto bailout and things like that. So even in President Obama, we have seen a transition into some different language. That's significant in our rhetoric-driven society. The other thing is, frankly, if you look at the Republican side of the race, I've been to Rick Santorum events. I do cover presidential politics for a living. I've been to Rick Santorum events that have had quite a populist edge to them, and you've heard Rick Santorum talking about what we have to do to renew manufacturing in this country and things like that, sounding not so let the government, or get rid of the government, more like maybe the government can help.
John, do you get a sense that there's a shared sense of anger, Tea Party, Occupy, the uprising in Wisconsin, that there's a sense that things aren't working the way they ought to, that we're not getting the results as a country, that we're slipping? Well, I got a sense that the Tea Party people were absolutely outraged that the government bailed out the banks.
Yep.
And the Occupy people are outraged that the banks got bailed out by the government. So there's slightly different targets there, but there's a similar sense that the big guys are getting taken care of, and nobody's really paying attention to my concerns, even my values to some extent.
Gentlemen, I should tell you, we only have about 40 seconds left, and we just brought up a big idea. So just if you want to get a quick...
I'll close this big idea off, whereas I can tell you that if somebody's really involved in the Tea Party movement, they can sit down with somebody who's really involved in Occupy and have a serious dialogue. It's people who are engaged. They may be angry at first, but they can actually talk about things, and I think that's real.
With the Nichols here, I had to add my 2 cents.
No, well, that's very investment. In 10 seconds, what's the future of Scott Walker? Give us the update on the recall.
He faces a recall election. He's very vulnerable. He will have a lot of money from around the United States, but the recall was put on the ballot by 30,000 volunteers. This is going to be a people power versus money power test, and it's going to be one of the most fascinating elections of 2012.
John Nichols, Kent Hughes, thank you very much.
Pleasure, John.
This is the book,
Thank
Uprising. Thank you, gentlemen. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.